let's talk a little bit about the right, not least because now you're unaffiliated, even freer to talk, no longer a Tory peer, an unaffiliated peer. Obviously, Reform have been leading in more than 100 polls now, given the nature of our politics at the moment. They could easily win a majority on that or could easily fall short. It's quite uncertain. The Tories, whilst had been, broadly speaking, sort of written off for a large part of this year, are starting to find their feet a little bit more under Kemi Badenoch, but that's arguably from a bit of a low base, dare we say. But what's been particularly telling is how politically there is a kind of clear story emerging amongst both parties, broadly speaking. They're quite in the Tory case, they're quite clearly kind of repudiating a lot of the things, net zero, soft, high migration, what have you, that they put in place during a long time in office, and Reform, the kind of set of issues that everyone has come to associate with them in terms of hardlining immigration, taking on a lot of these culture war issues, and so on and so forth. Where do you think the kind of, I suppose, how do you see this settling? What advice would you give to anyone who's looking to push back on this Labour government in terms of what they should be focusing on, what will get them elected and get them over the line?
Yeah, I think in a way, the kind of competition on the right has turned out to be quite a good thing. And, in fact, both parties are heading in the same direction, really. As you say, Tories are dismantling a lot of what we built up and sort of chasing reform on some issues, arguably overtaking on one or two, like immigration, who knows. But I think the direction of travel is clear, and I'm not sure if we hadn't had that competition, I'm not sure it would have been quite so clear a drift to the right. So that's a good thing. I mean, I think that the open issue is which party is more serious about kind of economic reform and liberalisation and market reform, and there's a question mark, I suppose, about reform. Tories trying to position themselves. The big problem Tories have still got, and I get it every time I do an interview and every time I talk to people, is why should we believe you this time? Look what a mess you made. That's and I think, and it may not be possible to get over that, in which case the party has a serious problem. The only way I think you might be able to get over it is to define what the party stands for and kick out the people on the left. I think only a small group, but they exist, who won't support it. The sort of social liberal Lib Dem opinion on the left of the party. That is the one visible thing that can be done to say, this is a different party, it won't happen again. It may not be enough and it may not work, but I think unless you do that, it's really hard to persuade people that this is a different party and going to go in the right direction. You're giving Reform a permanent advantage there. So that would be my advice to Kemi for what it's worth. And but I think it may be too late for her to take it if it's not too late for her necessarily. So that's my view.
Yeah, and then Chris, what have you made of the sort of Reform side of the ledger here in terms of what's been going on in the right? Because obviously they've been having a fair amount of polling success. They've been picking up, council by-election seats and obviously Westminster seats as well. There's been a lot of thrills and spills as well, and a lot of question marks over what it is they're at, beyond the issue of immigration, what it is they're actually going to stand for, I suppose. So what have you made of them over the course of the past year? Have they reassured you that there might be a government in waiting, or have they left you with more questions?
No, not yet, but I'm hopeful that they are putting together a sensible manifesto and looking at these things properly. The main job of the next government, whoever it is to repeal. It's not about tax cuts per se. It's about regulation. I think actually most people if you ask people in think tanks, more or less across the political spectrum, they will agree on certain things, which could save the country tens of billions of pounds. The SEND issue, the disability benefits, incapacity benefits, PIP, call it what you will, and our old favourite planning. I mean, these are just things where there would be no black holes at all if we just dealt with these issues. Unfortunately, Labour is not dealing with them. But they are there and they're so easy to deal with. I mean, as a very simple baseline, actually, of just getting things rocking again would be, let's go back to 2019. Not 6 years ago. Just go back to 2019. What were we doing in 2019 that we're not doing now? Well, we hadn't messed up the disability incentives, the incentives for claiming long-term disability. massive mistake by the Tories, never been fully understood by most people, and apparently by the current government. But we are hugely incentivizing young people in particular, but working age people in general, to claim fraudulently, basically, I would say, long-term disability. That has had a massive effect on the economy, not just in terms of paying out vast sums of money in benefits, but in, of course, them not working, which has a human cost on them as well, but also means they're not paying income tax. I mean, that one thing, just taking back the welfare system that we had 6 years ago, would make a massive difference. The send Motability, all this kind of nonsense, again, Tories are to blame, fine, revert to what it was previously. This is not radical stuff. This is not radical IEA free market stuff. This is just, it's been tinkered with in a disastrous way. Tinker it back again, and that's before we get to much more radical things to do with the NHS and education and planning system and all the rest of it. The answers are there. That's what's so frustrating. The answers are there, and I think this government knows what they are. They just won't do them. Triple lock is another one. Some of these things are more politically difficult than others. I understand that, but some of them actually would be really quite popular. The two-child benefit cap was a popular policy. As we said before on the podcast, it's a popular policy even with Labour voters. Why are you not doing it? Because you're beholden to your backbenchers. It's ridiculous. The IEA, we've got a grander vision of what a much smaller state would be. But a slightly smaller state could be so easily achieved without ruffling any feathers, really. And everyone deep down knows what needs to be done.
Yeah, I agree. I think, in my head, you actually need 2 terms to do what's necessary. I think that, and in the first term, you get spending back down to where it was in Gordon Brown's era. That's how bad things are and how much better things could be. And in the second term, you get it back to the early Blair era. And most people seem to think that, Britain under early Blair was quite good. Certainly on the left, people were okay with it. It's not like, radical small state, night watchman state world. It's just a sort of, it's just where we were, and it's not impossible to get back there. And I think the sort of cuts you're describing, Chris, and the sort of retrenchment, that's your first term. And then the second term, if you can prove that you can deserve it, then you need to go further.
Yeah.
And
first term, try and get back to 2007. Second term, try and get back to 1997.
yeah,
None of this is really that radical,
no,
because it's within our lifetimes. We can remember the time. And even at the time, a lot of people go like, the country's too left wing. We're spending too much money. But now Blair, and even in 2007, when he'd been splurging a huge amount of money on all sorts of things, particularly the NHS, people on our side of the divide were going like, oh God, I wish it was like Blair again. I wish it was 18 years ago.
yeah. I think
That's
really
how bad
think-
things are.
I agree, and I think also a lot of people have forgotten what it's like to live in a growing economy, 'cause we've had sort of this 20 years of where everything's been getting worse, growth's been getting slower. I'm old enough to remember what it was like in the Thatcher era and the 90s and the early Blair eras up to about 2005, and it just felt different. It felt like you could do things, you could aspire to build things, and you could sort of make yourself better off, and you had choices, and all that's kind of closed in, and we've had it for so long that if you're under 40, you think that's just normal. You kind of know it isn't, but you've no real reference point to remember what it was like when it was different. And we've got to get some of these animal spirits back and enthusiasm for what you can do with your life. It's just been closed off, and people are kind of giving up, and it's so depressing.
And just finally, Dave, before we move on to our final couple of questions, there's been a bit more conversation in the past week about, at least when we're recording this, it's coming out a few weeks hence, about uniting the right, about reform and the Tories in some kind of pact. Farage reportedly talking to donors about, if there is going to be an agreement, it will be a kind of reverse takeover and so on and so forth. This is all very up in the air. But is that something that you think is going to be, at the very least, more of a discussion point as we go forward? Because Reform have been doing tremendously well, certainly from where they started the last election. But given the fact that they are still kind of bumping around somewhere between high 20s and low 30s, the question about, why not stick those two parties together in some way, informal or formal, has become more of an issue. So do you see that as becoming more of a question as we go into the new year?
And I think it'll become a question as the election approaches. I don't know whether 2026 is that year because, there isn't going to be an early election, I don't think. Take complete catastrophe.
Labour aren't that stupid, I
No,
suppose,
exactly. I mean, the one
Yeah.
thing the last Tory government's MPs could all agree on until Rishi blew it was there wasn't going to be an election until the last possible moment, and the same will be true of Labour. So, as a matter of analysis, as the election approaches, if we are divided, then we're going to lose. Therefore, either one party has to absorb the other, or one party has to kill the other, or there has to be some kind of understanding or coalition. One of those things has got to happen, or we lose again. And I guess, the relative votes and the politics as we get a bit closer will determine which one of those actually happens. I mean, I think at the moment, Reform has not shown the ability to get into the last kind of lager of the Conservative Party of sort of socially liberal, affluent voters in places like Oxfordshire, Hampshire, around London, wealthy property owners. I'm not sure they can tackle them. So I find it quite plausible that the Tories could go quite a long time with sort of 15 to 20% of the vote. And therefore, we're confronted with this question on the right. But I just don't think it will be urgent this year unless something surprising happens.
Mhm.